Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. You know, as we meet today, our economy is going at historic levels. And, you know, this is directly attributable to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and some of the regulatory reform over the last couple of years. You know, the last 4 quarters, we've experienced highest GDP growth in 14 years. Wages are growing at the fastest rate in a decade. Our unemployment rate's at a 50-year low. And for the first time in history, we have more job openings than we do job seekers. This growth is great for all Americans, and it didn't happen by accident. You know, when I go out in my district and I talk with businesses about finding employees to go to work, it's because of the growth that they're experiencing, and they're having a difficult time finding employees to come and work for them. You know, the progress that we've made over the last 2 years by the President and the Congress, making sure that deregulation and the tax cuts happen. I mean, it's just hard to deny that that's working. I know there's been some debate back and forth about where it helps and who it helps the most, but it's making a difference for millions of American workers and families. Thanks to those lower tax rates, to a doubling of the child tax credit, to a nearly doubling of the standard deduction. You know, average middle-class families in Kansas are seeing over $2,200 of their hard-earned money that they're keeping in their pockets instead of paying in taxes. In addition, hundreds of companies with thousands of employees have expanded and added to the savings of their employees. So it's really tough to say that we're not seeing a lot of positive growth out of this tax reform. Recently, I met with an accountant in my district and talking about some of the CPA work that he did for some of his constituents, some of his clients. And according to him, 94% of the middle-class clients that he has benefited from the new tax law, including the lower rates, the doubling of the child tax credit, and the nearly doubling of the standard deduction. He also discussed about how people have seen in their paychecks be larger because of withholdings throughout the year. And depending on whether they had more withheld and the amount they had withheld, some saw larger refunds, some saw smaller refunds, depending on the amount that was withheld out of their check. And these people, these working class families, aren't part of the 1%. They're average middle class Kansans. And thankfully that observation is true across the country. You know, I want to talk a little bit about one of the major benefits that I see out of this is just the nearly doubling of the standard deduction. And, you know, prior to the changes from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, roughly 30% of Americans, taxpayers, had to itemize, going through all the paperwork, filling out those extra forms, going through that process. I know it's a burden for me, burden for others as well. Now expectations are that roughly 10% of the people will only have to itemize because the other 20% will get more benefit out of that standard deduction. And I know there was some discussion earlier and some mixed communication back and forth about the value of the standard deduction versus the value of the child tax credit. But if we were to just hold everything else equal, if we weren't able to make the child credit more refundable, whether we weren't able to change the rates any, but just focused solely on that standard deduction. Would any of you think we ought to lower that standard deduction back to the way it was? I mean, maybe just a show of hands of anybody that thought we ought to lower that deduction back.
It's hard to hold everything else equal. I mean, I really do think that you need to think about the standard deduction, the personal exemptions, and the child tax credit together as a package. And
I think we do need to look, we probably, when we make changes, we need to look at all of them. But if everything else were being held equal and that's the only thing we could change, I'd like to think that we would all be supportive of keeping it at the higher level and not reducing it. So in general, obviously we just talk about that as being a benefit and how do we help average taxpayers through this process. I have very little time left, but I want to get in one quick question for Dr. Holtz-Hagen. You know, one of the things that came up in another hearing, we talked a little bit about this digital tax that's being added by countries like France. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, just as a direct issue and how that might affect companies and whether that's a good idea.
I have a low opinion of that as tax policy. Most of those taxes are designed to hit only U.S. firms, and they are revenue taxes. They're not income taxes anyways, they're just sales taxes. So it's just an attempt to take the U.S. tax base and grab it in other countries.
Thank you. I yield back.